So I think we shall start because some of our speakers here will have to leave right after this round table. So this is closing a workshop which has been really very stimulating and very interesting. And what we've been doing is discussing the systemic institutional foundation, the forms and impact of big corporations and global financial actors' influence over policy making and regulation in the context of environmental emergency. Can say that the recent backrolling of large shares of the European Green Deal in the sphere of agriculture shows once more how easily public policies aimed at responding to the environmental emergency can be derailed by multifaceted corporate influence activity when they run counter agribusinesses' interests. On the more positive side, we are witnessing a remarkable upsurge of decentralized, innovative initiative with environmental friendly approaches and technologies. So we have a few leading questions that our speaker will be very free to interpret. The leading questions are, do you expect today's financialized capitalists to allow for the structural transformation at the scale and speed necessary to respond to the environmental crisis? What prospect do you see for reorienting the current global ultra-liberal trend of economic governance? And eventually, what are the major policy measures you deem necessary? Do you see, are they feasible in the presence of corporate capture? If not, what would be required to make them feasible? So we shall start, we shall go following the position here. So we shall start with Marc Fleurbaey, and he's a professor at PSI. He specialized in political philosophy, welfare economics, and normative economics. He's been researching and teaching in France, UK, and in the US. Among his contributions, Marc has developed an interdisciplinary study of the notion of responsibility in economics and philosophy, known as the ethics of responsibility. He has been an advisor to the World Bank, United Nations, and the OECD. He's contributed to several national and international commissions and reports on social issues related to well-being, social progress, public policy, and climate change. And he was part of the lead writing team of Working Group 3 in the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. And Marc will be talking about corporate governance and the stakeholder approach and how this fits in as a response to our question. Thank you.
Okay, so if I remember well, your first question was about whether the current system, and especially its capitalistic and financialized orientation, is likely to tackle the current crisis, and especially the environmental transition issues, on its own. And of course, one can only be pessimistic about that. The answer is probably no. But what I would like to develop here is a bit of a more optimistic vision about the possibilities, right? So we can be pessimistic about the trajectory, about the path that is in front of us, and optimistic about the possibilities, what would be possible if we were doing things right. So I would like to put this positive note on the table to start this conversation. We can indeed imagine that the current wave of initiatives on corporate social responsibility could become something quite powerful if it was generalized, if it was scaled up, and if if it was not something that belongs to the margins of the system where you have these cooperatives and third sector that is developing nice ways of functioning and developing new services and functioning in a way that is nicer to everybody, the customers and the workers and so on. But we need to, we can imagine that even the core of the economic engine, the main corporations, could be transformed and could have a better governance and could change their purpose. And the question of purpose is essential. Somehow the question of governance is instrumental in changing the purpose, right? If you want to have something that is happening at the level of the purpose, you need to have the proper governance to incentivize that. But and governance can have direct good effects on the people who are involved in the governance. But really, the change in purpose is what really matters, and that's where we need to see a sea change from a world in which the main guiding principle of management for firms is profitability, to something that is about serving all the stakeholders. And so you may remember the Business Roundtable of the US has made this, I don't remember in what year exactly, but has made this pronouncement that they changed their doctrine and they abandoned the religion of profit making as the sole goal, and saying we are responsible to all, and they underline all our stakeholders. And we want to serve all their interests. So that is something that, if it were implemented, and if it were implemented well, would indeed be changing the face of the earth, or at least the face of the business planet. And that would imply that you would have changes in, first, the abuse of market power. Right, so responsible firm is one that doesn't abuse and that doesn't exploit its market power, and that goes both in the direction of customers and in the direction of the labor market. And there are interesting research productions nowadays, both on the markup on the side of the product market and on the monopsony power on the labor market. So a responsible firm should not be using its market power, and it's relatively easy to imagine management guidelines that would enable firms to implement such responsible behavior. And by the way, the idea of not using market power is an idea that has been proposed by the very founding father of corporate social responsibility in a book that he published in the 50s. So this very idea has been there all the time in business ethics and can be implemented. So that's one element. Another element is to incorporate the externalities. And so to look at the bottom line, not just in financial terms, but adding to that something like the social cost or the social value of the externalities produced by the firm, which can be positive and can be negative. We talk a lot about greenhouse gas emissions, of course, so a lot of that is negative, pollutions and so on. There can also be positive externalities. What would be important, and now more and more consulting firms and think tanks are proposing that firms add to their bottom line a monetization of their externalities. And that's a very good idea, and it should really be generalized. And of course, you can imagine how hard it is for certain externalities. So biodiversity, for instance, super hard to compute the social value of degradation of biodiversity. But we need to start, and it's easy now to do it for greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, at some point, it will become feasible for biodiversity and so on and so forth. Same for social externalities. There could be monetization of certain social externalities. And it has been advocated by very mainstream economists for a long time, including Jean Tirole, Olivier Blanchard, and so on. So this is something that could be done. So, okay, market power, externalities. And another thing is the non-contractable decisions that firms are taking, working conditions, quality of products, and so on, things which cannot really be written, but are key to the well-being of the customers and the workers. Again, it's easy to define guidelines of responsible behavior in this arena. It's maybe a little more difficult to really monitor that things are done well, but again, guidelines for management can be done. So I would say these are the three key domains in which the behavior of firms would be changed if the firms change their purpose to not only serve their shareholders, but serve all their stakeholders. That's really something that's doable in a very, I would say, a very precise way. We can really write down the microeconomics of stakeholder value maximization. It works well. And it's not so difficult. But now the problem is, as I would say, I will come back to the pessimistic note. Will that happen? No, it will not happen. It can only happen if there is some regulation, right? The firms, and why is it impossible to see it happening spontaneously? Because when you are in a competitive environment, the less scrupulous, the nastier players have an advantage. Right? And so if you want to be virtuous in the market, good luck with that, because the others who are less virtuous than you will win. And so I'm almost done. So the competition, I'm very proud to have published in the Journal of Political Economy the following sentence: capitalism is a tragedy. Okay, and so why is it a tragedy? Because competition is undermining virtue, right? And so the Arrow de Breu market equilibrium has been essentially a flawed vision of the market. We have externalities, we have all sorts of problems of informational imperfections in the market, which make it impossible to be virtuous. And that should be recognized, and so we need to curb the ills of competition in a way that requires regulation. And why should we be pessimistic? Because it's in a globalized world, it's a global competition. And so if you want to do it in one country, it's impossible. If you want to do it in a region like Europe, it may be possible to some extent, but still hard. So it would really work well to do it at the world level. And good luck with that. So now it's politics and geopolitics, and it's very hard.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we move over to Yamina Saheb. Yamina is an engineer from Algeria, as well as an economist and PhD in energy science. She worked as a building expert in the Environment and Energy Efficiency Department of the International Energy Agency, where she created and directed Sustainable Building Center. In 2013, she joined the European Commission Joint Research Center as a scientific and policy expert in charge of analyzing European energy efficiency policies. She is now Senior Energy Policy Analyst in OpenExp, a global network of experts for sustainable development. And she's been a member of the IPCC since 2018. Please, Yamina.
Thank you. So, in the last IPCC report, I am from the climate mitigation group. There is in chapter 13, you will find that the counting of the climate policies between 2010 and 2020, they have more than doubled. The share of the emissions, global emissions covered by climate policies has more than doubled. So it was around 10%, and then we have more than 20% that are completely covered. And then when you have this, then you would think that, oh, so we are going in the right direction. But at the same time, there is another information that comes in chapter 2, is that during the same period, global emissions did not go down. Global emissions have been increasing at a rate of 1.5% per year. So obviously there is something that we are doing that is wrong. So we increase the number of policies, but at the same time our emissions are going up. What is wrong is the fact that we do climate policies, and I think it applies to all environmental policies as well, to all other policies, within the capitalistic economic framework, which is not possible. Because you have contradiction between the two. Capitalism is about accumulation without taking into account the effect of this accumulation on nature, including on humans. It's about continuous exploitation. And the green economy is about less exploitation or the use of resources without destroying them, actually. You have to keep in mind that you need the overall ecosystem for the continuation of life. Putting these two together, like when we talk about green capitalism or green growth, for example, is either it's you are lying when you put these two together, or you are trying to manipulate people, or you don't understand this big contradiction between the two. And the good illustration of this is maybe the European Union with the European Green Deal, because the European Green Deal is based, the policy that is behind the European Green Deal is the Growth and Stability Act. The Growth and Stability Act cannot lead to green the European economy. It can only lead to more carbon intensive or nature intensive industry that competes in this global world. And to change that, what we must do, and I think it goes through the law, we cannot do it, we cannot rely on corporates to do that, they will never do it. What would be good is that now that we are going to have the European election, is to introduce in the European law, because it's not going to work if we do it at the French level. The EU level is the the smallest scale where we may succeed, actually. So if you do, what we need to do is to have, in the European law, we need to introduce the ecological bankruptcy of the companies. When you introduce the ecological bankruptcy, then you do an ecological accounting, and then you don't need to go every day to try to fight against Total, for example. I take the example of Total Energy because it's their 100 year, yesterday was 100 years since it was established. So you don't need to do that because Total is in situation of ecological bankruptcy. And when you are in situation, we already have the law, if when we had the crisis, when banks were in situation of bankruptcy, then the government, we had governmental intervention. It came to rescue them. Because actually the reality is that it's about rescuing, taking control back. Because in the past there was this control and then we lost it. Taking back the control, and if the control is taken through the policies, so this means it's bringing back democracies in our systems or making our democracies healthier because today they are sick. And then you take this control, and then you can decide, and it's not going to be only Total, it will be Total, Shell, etc., all the oil companies, but not only the oil companies, but also petrochemical companies. We would not have had this deal with the farmers that we had recently. We would have a different deal in this situation because these companies are all ecologically bankrupted. And then this is where the government or citizens through the government, through the democratic system, can make this change happening. But to do that, the main challenge that we have, I think, is the fact that we are all infected, we are all sick with wrong concepts about capitalism. So capitalism, I learned it's about freedom. I learned it's about innovation. I learned it's about equity. But actually there is today enough empirical evidence that capitalism is about the opposite of all these things. And if you take all the concept, the way capitalism is, we learned it at school, and what people say about capitalism, most of what is said is completely wrong, is the opposite. And to understand that, you need to go back to the books, to the original books actually about capitalism, and not the interpretation that people have been repeating. And this is where schools, economic schools, have an important role to play. Because we have been lectured in the wrong way, but we are still, I think, lecturing in the wrong way. And that's why the youngest generation, they don't see any hope to get out of the current situation, because from ecological perspective, given that we crossed several of the planetary boundaries, the situation is going to be worse in the future, and there is nothing to expect from my perspective from corporates. Nothing, because the aim of corporate is not about delivering on societal and environmental benefits. The aim of corporate, in our world, is about more profit. And more profit is in contradiction with the societal and environmental goals. And this is why the European Union, its Green Deal can be only another failure, unless, but I don't think it's going to be the case, given that the new parliament that we will have and the new commission will be will have more people who are aware of the problem and who would like to tackle the causes of the problem. Because if we do not tackle the causes of the problem, which is the capitalism, we cannot solve the environmental issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now we'll move over to Gabriel. Gabriel Zucman is Associate Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the University of California. He's Professor at Paris School and Director of the EU Tax Observatory. He has been a co-author with Thomas Piketty of the book Capital is Back, where they investigate the evolution of aggregate wealth to income ratio in the top 8 developed economies to show that those ratios have recently risen to levels unknown since the 18th and 19th century. He is the author of The Hidden Wealth of Nations, The Scourge of Tax Haven, and his papers on tax haven are among the most cited ones, and he contributed with significant work on the quantification of financial scale of tax avoidance, relying on base erosion and profit shifting. a technique employed by multinationals. So now I give the floor to Gabriel, talk about taxes, probably.
Probably, yeah. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for being here. I'd like to pick up maybe with what Marc mentioned, which is that we all agree that there is a need for new regulations to steer corporations towards a more multi-stakeholder model. We all agree that there is a need for environmental taxation, for profit taxation, to accelerate the transition to a zero-carbon economy. We all agree with that, and the big problem is always about, okay, how do we achieve these things in a globalized economy, where there's always going to be one country or several countries that, you know, refuse to join those efforts and play the game of tax and regulation, competition, you know, leading to a race to the bottom. And that's really the crux of the issue. Okay, if we want to change the world, we need to invent a new regulation of globalization. We need to invent new forms of international coordination. And what I want to say is that I'm relatively optimistic, in fact, about our ability to address those real problems of international competition. And I think we can make some progress in the near future. And essentially, there are two tracks. One track is we can create new international agreements. We can change the treaties that regulate globalization, and I'm going to start with that. And the other track is there are a number of policies that can be implemented unilaterally by countries, and that can be very effective in fostering actual change. So let me start with the first one, with international agreements. So we have lots of international agreements about many things, about international trade, for instance. But what characterizes these international agreements is that they are essentially mostly silent about taxation. They're silent about the environment. They're silent about inequality. They're silent about the big issues of the 21st century. But okay, that's a choice that we've made, you know, to have those treaties, that form of regulation of globalization since the 1980s. And of course, there are many other possible institutional arrangements, and there are many other treaties that could be written. And the truth is that we are at a turning point where we are seeing perhaps the emergence of a new regulation of globalization. The most striking example is what has happened in 2021 when 140 countries and territories agreed on a minimum tax for multinational companies, on a minimum tax rate of 15%. So it was the first time that there was an international agreement on a minimum tax rate. Okay, so from that perspective, it's really a landmark in the regulation of globalization. It shows something very important and very simple, which is that tax competition, regulation competition, is not some kind of law of nature. Okay, it's a policy choice that we've made not very democratically or very consciously or in a very, in a manner that was very transparently debated since the 1980s, but that's a choice that was made, and we are starting to make other choices. And of course, that agreement has all sorts of limitations. The tax rate of 15% is really very far from what we need. And it has all sorts of exemptions and loopholes and problems, but at least, it shows a horizon, a perspective, of another form of regulation of globalization, and we can build on that to have more ambitious international agreements in the future, with a higher minimum tax rate for multinational firms, with much higher tax rates for firms in the extractive sector, with very high tax rates on the excess profit of polluting firms, for instance, that we really badly need for the transition to zero carbon. So I think it really opens a realm of possibilities. There is at the moment the beginning of a conversation internationally on creating a minimum coordinated tax on billionaires. Since we've been able to do something, again, limited and imperfect, but really a turning point and very different from what was done in the past, we've been able to do something for multinational firms. we could apply that approach to very wealthy individuals and say, look, we can agree collectively on saying that billionaires or centimillionaires, very rich people should pay a minimum amount of tax. And there is the beginning of an international conversation on potential agreement on these issues. So that's one thing. But the more important thing is, okay, look, what can be done by countries unilaterally? Because it's true that even if there is this 15% global minimum tax, rate is very low, and it's going to be hard to get ambitious agreements if we make, consensus a kind of starting point. If we require the participation of almost all countries, it's going to be very hard to reach anything significant. What's really important to understand is that there's a lot that countries can do unilaterally. So it's not true that if you want to regulate companies or if you want to tax their profits, you have to do it, at the EU level or at the global level, or otherwise nothing's going to happen. You could imagine rules that essentially the big idea is this. To the extent that you have a big market, that consumers are located in a country, that's that's from what firms derive their profits. And so the market countries where people live, where consumers live, have a lot of leverage. They have a lot of power over multinational companies. So any country can say, look, if you want to have access, to keep having access to our market, you being a company, you will have to comply with a certain number of regulations and a certain taxes. And we're already doing that. We already have clauses like phytosanitary requirements and international agreements that say, look, you can't sell products in France if you don't comply with X and Y. We are going to have now at the EU level the CBAM, that says, look, if you don't pay enough carbon tax abroad, you will have to pay some carbon tax in the European Union if you want to have access to our market. But that logic, we are starting to see, mirror clauses in international trade agreements that say that the norms that apply to our domestic producers should also apply to foreign producers who have access to our markets. And we can extend that logic much more than what we've been doing so far. We could extend that logic to taxation, for instance. We could say, look, if you, Apple or Amazon or any company, if you want to keep having access to the French market, let's say, and you pay too little tax abroad, in 1 minute, okay, and I'm almost done, and you pay too little tax abroad, then you will have to pay an extra tax in France if you want to keep having access to our market. If you pay too little abroad, the norm in France is 25% or 30%, we will ask you to collect some of the taxes that other countries choose not to collect, and that's their right. But if you want to keep selling in France, you will have to pay more taxes in France. And the power to do that really lies in the big countries where people live, where there are big markets. So I think I'm not saying, and I'll conclude with that, I'm not saying this is going to be easy. I'm not saying that it will be totally painless. I think it requires rewriting international treaties, changing the laws, and so on. But I think this is the direction that we need to take if we want to be able to reconcile globalization on the one hand with economic justice, climate justice on the other hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we'll listen to Nathalie Blanc. Nathalie Blanc is Director of Research and Director at CNRS and Director of the Center for Earth Policy. She's a founding member of the French Environmental Humanity Portal. Her recent research project includes supporting adaptation to climate change through citizen empowerment and investigating intersection between socio-environmental inequalities and collective mobilization at the scale of Greater Paris. Nathalie is also an artist and curator currently working on ecological fragility. And she leads the Lab Art Science laboratory with several projects that include experiments and exhibition. And she is also part of the École. There are a few people from there. It is a network of groups of researchers in France working on political ecology. So please, Nathalie.
So thank you very much. I am not an economist, I am a geographer, and I do a lot of field work, which is my main research, not only in Greater Paris. I've been working on mobilization at all scales, even in Russia for a while. And what I see on the field in different cities or different places is how much capitalism, especially financial capitalism, has forgotten people's immediate needs in terms of the power to reproduce one's life in environment. And so I do consider that there is a great difference between adaptation and to the current and future consequences of climate change and mitigation. Mostly people have been talking of mitigation and how to fund mitigation, but what I see doing fieldwork is how much capitalism has neglected somehow adaptation. And that's very well written, I think, in the last IPCC reports, and how much territories are left to their own devices. And there is a need of a networked ecology of subsistence that is going to take place in the years to come. So this division between adaptation and mitigation is structured through decades. I would say that one of my colleagues did his first PhD with me in 2010 on adaptation to climate change. And at the time, in 2010, working on adaptation was considered to be a liberal device. I mean, you would adapt because you didn't have any choice. That means that you choose not to regulate. And at the time already, you could see that people would have to adapt, that the climate inertia would mean that territories would have to adapt. And on the other hand, regulating, mitigating was seen as a very, very proactive policy, and that would conduct to less gas emission. So this division was not only structuring the academic debate, but it was also structuring most policies at the local level, but also at the international level. You could see that the first policies for adaptation, especially in France, were also in the 2010, and that supported, this division supported also a north-south cleavage, because northern country could had to mitigate and would have more resources to adapt, while southern countries had less need to mitigate and more need to adapt. So it was also a geographical division. So it's important, I think, nowadays to reflect upon the fact that when we still thinking about the responsibility of the corporate world, we're not talking about adaptation, we're mostly talking about mitigation. And I think this has a huge weight on local policies. So, and that's true what you said earlier, that there is a decrease in terms of gas emission, but it has been done at the expense of population and their living environment. So I think this is a division which could be studied and should be studied by economy, because it had a structural impact, and also because it means that the economy we should revalorize at the territorial scale is not there to be revalorized. And so there is a wide gap between current levels of adaptation and those required in the face of climate risk. And most of the adaptation we see in different territories is very small scale, unevenly distributed geographically speaking, and sector specific eventually, and in response to observed impacts. And this divide, this unequal development, will continue to grow as much as we're not paying attention to this device. So, also there is another point about that. Its adaptation do represent a very small portion of climate funding. And it comes mainly from public sources, and we see that in territories which are not very rich, mainly in the forms of grants, and the private sector is very much lacking in terms of adaptation. And so some colleagues have been telling me that insurance sector would compensate for the lack of public and other private fund. And what we see once again, that it is not the truth, that insurance are extracting themselves from many places, and the necessity to insure the goods and people and territories which are being involved. So I think we should pay attention more to this divide and forget about the belief that we can be supported by the insurance sector in terms of adaptation.
Thank you very much. Now so I'm not commenting, the comments will come from the audience after Thierry has talked. So Thierry Philipponnat was a banker and a financial markets professional for 20 years. Since 2006, he's been focusing on studies of the links between the economy, finance, and society. He was a member of the executive board of Amnesty International France and became involved in different campaigns related to the impact of business. And now I've lost so when you started, so in 2011, Thierry founded Finance Watch, which he directed a few years, and he's been the director of an economic think tank, Freelance Institute, and chaired French Sustainable Investment Forum. In 2019, he rejoined Finance Watch as the head of research and advocacy, with research focused on prudential regulation, financial stability, including the impact of climate change, as well as sustainable finance and sustainable fiscal policy. So, please, Thierry.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here to discuss this issue. If you allow me, I'll take the title of our panel and try to reflect on it. I think the title is, Can Green Capitalism Respond to the Environmental Emergency? That inspired me a few reflections. First of all, I see capitalism as based on a dream of infinite, and I said infinite, wealth accumulation. It's not me speaking, it's Fernand Braudel. I'm a great fan of Fernand Braudel. And he makes, as we know, a distinction between market economy and capitalism. And the distinction is, if you dream of infinite wealth accumulation, then you're a capitalist. And I think, of course, there can be debate, but that's a very, very important point. So let's keep it in mind. And it's one of the ingredients to respond to the question. The second point I'd like to make, which you heard me already mention briefly yesterday, is that I don't think we're any longer in a strictly capitalist economy. We're in a hybrid economy, where the upside, the benefits, go into private pockets, and the downside is borne, the losses, is borne by society. So this is not, strictly speaking, capitalism. I'm having cold analysis. Strictly speaking, capitalism, if you win, you win. If you lose, you lose. We're not even in capitalism any longer. We're in a system where, whether when there's a crisis, that's the bailout of economic interest, financial system, etc., but also the economy, look at what happened during the COVID crisis, or to promote what governments think are necessary private activities, economic activities. That's the IRA in the US, that's state aid in the EU. That's public money at the end of the day, going into promoting private interest. That's the second ingredient that we have to bear in mind to respond to the question, in my view. And I'll come back very briefly. I'll try to be very brief on that. Third point is capitalism, yes, but financial capitalism. And what is financial capitalism, in my view? Very short definition. In theory, financial capitalism is not that. In theory, the economy is the dog and finance is the tail. And the dog must be wagging the tail. Financial capitalism is exactly the opposite. The tail wags the dog. What am I saying here? Let me give you a very concrete example. In theory, on financial markets, price formation is the result of whether a company is profitable or not, and then you decide I can pay whatever price or a price for the company because I'm fine paying 10 times this year's profit, so company has a profit of 10, I can pay 100 because I'm comfortable paying 10. 10 times the profits. That's the theory. That's the dog, and the tail follows. Financial capitalism is exactly the opposite. The market decides, and I could give you examples, I don't think we have time, but launch me on it if you want to give you very concrete examples, that the company is worth 1,000, even though it makes 1 of profit, so 1,000 times its profit, when it's launched on the market. And guess what? The mere fact that you decide that it is worth so much makes it powerful, because when you're worth a lot, you're very powerful, and your share price becomes a currency, and you can acquire competitors through that new currency, overvalued currency, called your share price, and you become a monopoly. That's what Amazon did. I'll stop here. Happy to discuss it as long as you wish. Fourth point, we talk a lot about the transition, but there's no transition. There's an accumulation of renewable energy on top of fossil fuel energy production. So there's an accumulation, but there's no transition at the moment. So that's something very, very important to bear in mind, because obviously, if you're at the head of a corporation, well, you're absolutely fine developing renewable energies and etc., as long as you continue doing business as usual at the same time. The biggest, as you know, I do a lot of work on banking and financial systems, the biggest green banks of the world, I'll be very generous, they are green banks, are also the biggest brown banks of the world. I mean, Office A finances oil, coal, and gas, and Office B finances solar, wind, etc., etc. And there's no contradiction. Well, it's business. Business is business. I finance the world as it is. That's the way it works. The fifth point, I'll be very, very brief because Marc touched on it. I'll put slightly different words. This is exactly the same thing. We have a collective action problem. Obviously, we need to work together globally. It's a global issue. And obviously, transitioning towards a different way of organizing society makes you, everything else being equal, less competitive in the short term. So in a world where we all collaborate, well, fine, you're doing the right thing, so I'm not going to try to take advantage of that while you're not quite as competitive, then it can work. We know the world we live in, and this is true for corporations, and obviously that's true also for international cooperation. Needless to start on the aggressive world we live in, where cooperation is well, it does not exist. I mean, it's so marginal. It's certainly not at the global level, and we don't have any global governance system. So what do we do with that? Do I have more time?
Not much.
Not much. Okay, so I'll emphasize one point, and then we discuss. I think on the hybrid economy point, society, if we want to be positive and not only pessimistic, has to put conditionality when public money goes to support private interest, whether to develop or to bail out. Because if not, that's more hazard, that's a blank check. If it wins, it's for you. If it loses, it's for me. Thank you very much. Can I play? So as long as society doesn't put conditionality on that way of functioning, which, by the way, is perhaps in a number of cases the right way of doing it, But as long as conditionality is not added, we will not go anywhere. So if you ask me, hey, please try to be positive, and I'm the most powerful man in the world tomorrow morning, and I can decide everything I want, I decide that, okay, you can have public money to be saved or to develop, but there's a condition on that, and you need to give back to society. There will be many other things, just to launch you on financing, adaptation, mitigation, SGP, insurance. Happy to discuss all those topics as well.
So, thank you very much. There were many very important topics that were addressed in these different interventions. So now I would like to open the floor for questions and interventions or comments, short comments. Please.
Thank you. Yes, you can hear me. I just wanted to give a little comment about the fact that corporate seems to be the big winner, but also the big cheater in the system. And because we all talk about competition, but actually, from my point of view, they also an example of extreme and radical collaboration inside the enterprise. So it's always competition and collaboration together. It's not only competition. But my main question was about something that is not mentioned, which is the climate justice, because it's all about human society, and it's quite well known that someone that didn't recognize his past, will repeat it. And if we have plenty of examples of these big corporate companies cheating on the system and not damaging the collective interest, so isn't a way that the economic system and economists help the society to produce all the proof necessary to establish and do a process again and a humanity against those corporate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would feel for responding?
Well, there is two other questions our colleague was supposed to ask us. So the last question was, what are the solutions? I was thinking in terms of climate justice, a global framework for climate justice. So that is part of the response I will do later. So I think it's very important.
Yeah, on this point about climate justice, it's not related only to corporate, but it's also related to government. So I give you an example. So the climate neutrality target that we decided to set for ourselves for 2050 does not take into account our past emissions. If we would have taken our past emissions, so the EU plus the UK, the formal EU 28, should be climate neutral by 2033. And France, for example, should be climate neutral by 2028, the UK 2025, like Germany as well. And what does that mean from climate justice perspective? It means that all our emissions as Europeans between 2033 and 2050 are emissions that are taken from the carbon budget of the other countries. And then we claim to be climate leaders, and we talk about climate justice, but we never talk about this issue. And then when you add to this the fact that, so for example, in the climate neutrality target scenarios that we have, even those included, unfortunately, in the IPCC report, so in these scenarios, they do not take into account these historical emissions, and that's why they do project climate neutrality target by 2050 for everyone. So how can you explain this to someone who was born in sub-Saharan Africa, who is currently living in sub-Saharan Africa? Because he does not have access to the modernity that we have access to, that is linked to our emissions, but at the same time, this guy has to be climate neutral by 2050, like the same boy if he would have been born in Europe. And there was, and this is why I think scientists and have an important responsibility in this in this issue of climate, in the framing of climate justice, because so for example in these scenarios we do project climate neutrality by 2050 for our countries by decarbonizing the energy system. So we will not have energy fossil fuels in OECD countries. However, they do project climate neutrality in the global south with fossil fuels. And then how they do that, they do project that in these countries we will have negative emissions with technologies, unproven technologies that are extremely expensive, that are not accessible to these countries. And it means that we will capture the carbon and stock it in the land. And then we create another injustice, which is basically the land in these countries, where the land today is needed to build infrastructure and to produce food, will no longer be used for food and infrastructure. It is projected to be used to stock emissions.
Okay.
Sorry, so just one point. And the companies, just to link to the corporates, who are the companies who are investing in fossil fuels with public money from the global north? These are corporates from the global north. So, for example, ECOP project is good illustration in Africa of this kind of project that just extend. I call this an extension of colonialism or neo-colonialism vision of the word of climate neutrality, because it extends our colonial heritage, but we keep talking about climate justice.
Okay, thank you. So if there is another intervention from.
Hello, my name is Alina, and I work actually with concentrated solar power technology. And basically in our industry, the biggest problem is when we come to the bank. I'm a researcher, so it's more from the research point of view. I saw the developer had this kind of problem. When they come to the bank normally they would give them a very high interest rate because the technology is not that developed and they have high risks. And basically this reflects on the higher LCOE then. And of course the technology becomes much less competitive than nuclear power plants, for example. So basically in the industry we had high hopes for the green finance, which could have some sort of this redirection of the profitability toward the green investments. And I would like to take advantage of your expertise and know a bit more about your views on green finance as a vector of this green capitalism, which we talk about today. What are your views on that? Thank you.
Okay, so I think this is a question a little bit for Thierry, or if there is.
There are several dimensions to your question. I would say that, and it's not a paradox, if you want to address green finance, you have to first address brown finance. Because finance, the financial cost is, of course, absolutely, it's also relative. Today, the risk, what's the price of financier? What's the job of financier? Putting a price on a risk. Today, the risk of providing capital to fossil fuel, oil, gas, coal, is enormously underestimated by our prudential regulation. You can think, why is he talking about this? Because if you underestimate the risk, then you allow the financier, whether investor or bankers, to provide capital at too low a cost. And therefore, you implicitly subsidize the cost of fossil fuel financing and then for fossil fuel exploration, exploitation, etc. This is a huge topic. This is the biggest topic we have, well, on your question. Once you've solved that, and by the way, there's a very simple solution. 1 minute of advertisement, go on the website of Finance Watch, you'll find plenty of reports on the subject. That's a subject we've been working on for years and years. And by the way, everybody that has looked into it agrees it's a huge problem. There's a simple solution. Not one single political group in Europe, not one single, none of them, backed it before, despite the fact that they agreed there was an easy solution to a big problem. Okay, until we've sorted that out, the relative cost of green finance will be too high. And yes, and I say we because I do a lot of, it's part of my job, work on green finance, sustainable finance, necessary condition, but not sufficient to make a difference. Why is that? Because until you keep on implicitly subsidizing brown finance, let's call it brown, it's not a very good expression, but let's be more precise. Financing going to fossil fuel, let's be very precise, that's what I'm talking about, okay? Until you've sorted that out, you will have a pull of attraction of capital in the wrong direction, and therefore not in the direction of, let's call it green finance for lack of a better word. That is, in my view, the essential. And all the sustainability reporting, I spent 30% of my time on sustainability reporting, so I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. Yes, we should do it, but will not change the world by itself, even though it's a necessary condition.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Take another question, please.
Hi, so I'm Thomas Lambert from Erasmus University in Rotterdam. So I have a question because you mentioned the collective problem that we have, and I had more a question about maybe it's a question directed probably to Gabriel Zucman about the success, the relative success of an international of a tax on a multinational profit. So if we think about climate change, etc., the question of a universal carbon tax is important. But can you elaborate a bit on the international free rider problem that we may have? What can we expect from countries? Can we expect like a club of countries taking the lead on the questions? So how can we make some countries to agree on this, because of course they have different interests, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. A very important question. So the most important idea is that you need to have some countries that play the role of tax collector of last resort. Okay, so this is really what's missing today. So today you have some countries that free ride in the sense that, okay, they offer very low corporate tax rates or zero or no carbon tax. Fine. And the other countries basically don't do anything to offset that. They say, okay, if you, Bermuda or Ireland, choose to have a very low corporate tax rate, that's your right, and we're not going to interfere with that. What's missing is what other countries could do is they could say, fine, keep implementing your very low or your zero tax rates, but we are going to collect the taxes that you have chosen not to collect. That's really the key principle. And of course, if you're a tiny country yourself, you cannot really do that, because then businesses will move away. They will just say, okay, look, if France, if let's say, a tiny country on its own started to impose extra taxes to big multinational companies, those companies would choose not to serve that country anymore. But if you create coalitions of countries, you can start addressing that problem, and especially if you have some countries, with a significant market share, those countries can always say, as I was explaining, if you want to keep having access to our market, we are going to collect some of the taxes that you have avoided abroad. So let me give you one simple illustration. So what any country could do is it could say, okay, so for instance, let's take the case of France. France could say, look, there's a norm in France which is 25% corporate tax. That's what regular companies in France have to pay. And so we can compute the tax deficit of any multinational company relative to that norm. What does it mean? It means for any company like Apple, for instance, you could compute how much extra tax Apple would have to pay globally if it was subject to a 25% minimum tax rate in each of the countries where it operates. You can make that computation very easily. And then France can say, look, we are going to collect that tax deficit, perhaps not all of it, but a fraction of it. What fraction? France could say, look, if you make 10% of your sales in France, we are going to collect 10% of that tax deficit. So if you have a $10 billion global tax deficit and you want to keep having access to the French market, then you have to pay an extra $1 billion tax to France. You can compute this corporate income tax deficit, you can compute a carbon tax deficit, you can apply that approach to everything. And the key idea is just, having access to a market has to come with certain duties, and especially, tax and environmental duties.
Thank you.
Thank you. This question is for Marc Fleurbaey, I think. You said that in your intervention, you said that one way forward would be monetizing externalities, including biodiversity. And I wonder, would that not risk trapping us even further in monetizing everything? And I'm thinking of this book called The Value of a Whale, where the reason would be to save a whale would be that it's worth X amount of money instead of just it being a living being that we shouldn't kill. So yeah, I wonder what your thought is on that.
Yeah, thanks for asking it, because all non-economists always raise this question when economists talk about monetizing. So yeah, it's very important to address this issue. So in fact, we don't really need to monetize things. What we need to do is to put a value on something in a relevant numeraire, in a relevant measuring rod, right? Which we need not be money. Money is not so important as such. Why do we always talk about money as the natural option? Because money is so important in monetizing, in measuring, financial, economic activities and so on. And so if we want to make these things commensurable, and if we want to put pressure on the economic decisions that have an impact on other things, we need somehow to incorporate in the computation of the decision makers something that will be meaningful to them. And so when we monetize something, we are not saying this thing is just can be put on the market and we can buy it and destroy it and so on. No, that's not the point. The point is to incorporate it in the computation of the decision makers that look at the bottom line and their profitability. And so, and the additional thing is, you may have heard about this debate between strong sustainability and weak sustainability. And it's always said that if we put a value on natural assets, it's as if they had something that was just a monetary value, and they could be replaced by human-made assets, and so they could be destroyed and there would not be a problem. That's a wrong understanding of monetizing, because when you do monetizing, you can rely on market prices, but that's the wrong approach. What you need really to put is a value on these things that really measures their social importance, right? Their importance to society. And when I say social, I should say their importance to the planet as a whole, right? And so it's not just the humanity, it's also the other species. And so if, for instance, we come close to a critical threshold on destroying biodiversity, then the value, when we do this computation of monetizing, the monetary value of these objects that we are destroying goes to infinity. And then it becomes a very high priority to protect them, right? And so it's not as if the prices were fixed and didn't depend on the... No, the prices we use in this monetizing exercise are not the market prices. They are prices that reflect the importance to the planet of these things. And this importance can be as high as you want if it is really critical for the sustainability of our path.
So first, thank you for your clear answers. I had a question about the role of competition in the transition, because I was thinking that there may be a complicated relationship between environmental transition and market power that we see in the rise of arguments for green antitrust, like horizontal exemptions for firms so that they can cooperate on environmental matters. So maybe there could be a trade-off between environmental matters and, for example, the prices that consumer pays. So I was just asking if you think that there is really a trade-off, and if so, what decisions should we make?
Okay, so I don't know, this is a question for you too.
Yes. So, actually, let me add one layer of complexity to this issue, because, market power is very bad because it reduces the economic activities, right? It shrinks the markets. When you impose a monopoly power, is essentially putting a tax on the customers, and it reduces the activity. And so it may happen that the use and the abuse of market power is reducing economic activity in a way that's good for the environment. So it may somehow be a substitute for the PIGU tax that we should put on externalities. And so if we want to do things right, we should not use market power, and we should have the tax on externalities. But if we don't do things right, sometimes maybe we may happen to have a sort of second best that's not too far from what we should be doing. So that adds one more layer of complexity. So what you were talking about was not exactly that, right? It was about the idea of having collaboration on certain green activities. And so it makes me think a little bit of what's going on with research and development, where there are already consortiums of things happening between firms, where they are allowed to collaborate on certain projects, and this is kind of compatible with having competition down the line when they really implement the innovations. So it looks a little bit like that, and I'm not an expert of what's going on in these R&D consortiums, but to me it sounds like some method like this could probably work, and would not be. I think Mireille would have much more to say about that if she could.
So I'm Terry Hathaway. I'm from the University of York. So I'm from the University of York, and one of the things that I always wonder about when people talk about capitalism is what do you mean, which is not something that obviously we're going to answer definitively today. But like in terms of thinking about what capitalism is, I always think about the legal foundations. And the last person who was executed in the UK for bankruptcy was executed in 1812 in York, which is after the advent of capitalism. The corporate legal form originates in the 1850s, also after the advent of capitalism, and it fundamentally changes capitalism. Both come to reduce the risk of accumulation. Bankruptcy is now a right rather than something that you get executed for. Actually, if anyone wants to come to York, you can go and see the old debtors' prison, where they used to put people in chains and sell their family into slavery, if that's what you want to do. The corporation also now works as a legal shield. Limited liability, which is central to the corporate legal form, is a form of social insurance for potentially entirely feckless investors and shareholders. So is capitalism as it is currently constituted inherently irresponsible? And if so, how going forward do we ensure that individuals are held responsible for actions that they take as part of corporations? That's my question.
Let me just say one word. I've been actually a co-founding member of the International Panel on Social Progress, where we discussed a lot of things about changing the corporation. And one of the issues was indeed limited liability. And so we were pushing for actually abolishing limited liability altogether, more or less. And indeed because of this kind of problem, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. This is going to be a very partial response to your question. But yet again, another reflection is, and I follow what Marc said on externalities and being an economist myself, I see and the virtue and the merit. But I could argue that when it comes to capitalism, those are not externalities, they're internal. Because we're exhausting, the system, forget the we, the system is exhausting the planet's resources. And that's how it makes its profit. Someone, forgive me, whoever it was, said this morning that there was notion of if you take the ecological impact into account, companies are not profitable. Okay, so that, look, we're all saying the same thing, we're just putting different words, I'm taking different door of entry. But if you consider what is usually called as externalities for good reasons, we know all the theory behind it, has a lot of merits, but as in internalities, if you can call them like that, then that's the answer, well, that's partial answer to your question. Because the system effectively is not profitable if you take it like that. And obviously that comes down also, and mind you, I'm very pessimistic on this is not going to change, to the accounting system. Because our accounting system does not consider those issues. Some very interesting initiatives have been taken, you know, this CARE initiative and some others, that precisely try to address that question. But the accounting norms, the accounting standards that rule the world, because obviously accounting standards are a vision of the world, do not account for that. But accounting is a language, it's a vision of the world. And as long as you have that system, it will not change my lifetime. That's how optimistic I am, and I hope I will live a few more years. So I'm not saying it's the solution for tomorrow morning, okay? But I think that's an angle to respond to your question. I didn't say I responded completely, and please, you know, let's get the dialogue going if you wish.
Okay. Gabriel, you have to leave. Do you want to say a few words on that? No? Okay. So. Okay.
Thank you for the very interesting discussion. I just wonder if someone can comment on degrowth. I was hoping to hear about that, and it wasn't mentioned. So, please, thank you.
I can comment on it a few words, because I think that looking at territories means that you need a fresh look, you develop a fresh look to people's needs. And looking at what people needs on the territories mean you see that that the green capitalism was mostly done in terms of supply, to favor supply side action, in favor of innovation and growth, promoting entrepreneurs, which is an essential feature of capitalism. So the idea, looking at degrowth, and we're working with many people in this field, is to look anew at people's need and to see how much we can develop another look, another way to see the economy. I was thinking, for example, not only of degrowth, because degrowth is very much a way to reconsider what means growth. I mean, it is a theory which has been developed against growth as such, being the essential characteristic of capitalism. But if you go further and try to see what kind of economy you would like, which wouldn't be growth. So I was looking recently at the foundational economy, meaning that we go look at people's need in terms of infrastructure, for example, social, but not only social infrastructure, but also ecological infrastructure, because we need green, not only just to make a pretty city, but also to breathe and to have other response. And so this is a way to look at the growth. It's a good response, interesting response, because it opens the door to a critique of growth. But it's not and we need to go further nowadays. And I think that the feminist economy has taken a good take at it towards an ecology of subsistence, for example, or towards a foundational economy. So that's, we could go back to that. And I think that right now, the ecological emergency is just a pretext for techno-solutionist flight. And mitigation is very much defined in this way by a socio-ecological transition that favors technological innovation mostly.
Yeah, I don't look at degrowth, I look at on what we call sufficiency, which is la sobriété in French. Sufficiency, why? Because sufficiency is about meeting human well-being within the planetary boundaries. So you have the upper floor, which is planetary boundaries, so you do not cross that. So you have an economy that does not allow you, or policies that do not allow the economy to cross this boundary. But at the same time, and it's very important, it goes to the question of climate justice and to justice and equity, you must have a lower floor to make sure that everyone has access to decent living standards. Otherwise, you will just extend this current and the inequalities that were inherited. And this is what I think this is, I'm calling this now an economy for livable planet. So it's not like there are plenty of differences with degrowth, and what I personally do not like with the concept of degrowth, because it links to the word growth. So basically you take one indicator, or you take concepts that already exist with all the misunderstandings that we have about capitalism and growth, etc., and then you try to do something else with it. It's extremely difficult, and this is why maybe they started in the 17th and they are not as successful as that. It's that now they make more noise about it, but I don't think they are successful, the degrowth community.
So, do you want to answer? Or yeah.
I mean, yeah, so the word growth and degrowth, we should always ask growth and degrowth about what, right? What is growing? Of course, we would like well-being to grow. If it's about degrowing well-being, it's terrible. So, and so much can be done for human well-being. So, yeah, but of course we need to reduce environmental degradation. So we need to reduce a lot of activities and a lot of use of material and so on. Sure. So we need to degrow all of that. But now an interesting question on which I don't have the answer is, can the monetary value of economic activities continue to grow a lot? It's not obvious, right? Because you can have a decoupling between material use, or the use of material, and the economic value. So we could put a lot more emphasis in our activities on science, on knowledge economy, and so on. Put a lot of value on that, which is to some extent immaterial. To some extent, not fully, because information needs to be stored somewhere and so on. But so there might still be a lot of potential for the growth of economic value, but as soon, provided that it is sufficiently dematerialized. But that's an empirical question, so I don't really have an answer.
Okay. Yes. There is a question. So, okay. So I think one of the things you said is that we need a new framework. We need to be able to put value on non-economic value, quantify the social value and the externalities. But at the same time, we've been talking a lot about the lobbying efforts of firms. So my question is a little bit naive, but how do we make sure that in our efforts to change the framework and to put measures on the social and environmental value, we don't put a framework that is flown because of the lobbying efforts of firms? So basically, how do we put that into action practically?
I think I was today and yesterday too with local representatives of diverse mobilization, amongst which Finance Watch is somewhat involved. And I think that we need the growing pressure of this mobilization at different scales in order to be like a watchdog, as this is how you say it, and to verify that this new framework is not flawed. Apart that, I think that we can't be assured that everything we do will be for the best in the future, because we have a very limited take of the complexity of the problem. And that's my take on it, because when we thought of the divide between adaptation and mitigation in the 10th, we thought that it was a political divide in terms of liberal, non-liberal, and regulation policy. But what we see nowadays is just the contrary. So sometimes things just happen to be different. And talking about mobilization, I would like to underline the fact that there are all kinds of mobilization. Some are watchdogs, like big mobilization, and they do a very important job at the price of their lives, at the price of their of their tranquility. And the recent report by the European Defensor of Human Rights said something about it, saying that the pressure on this mobilization throughout Europe and throughout the world was worsening, and people are being jailed when you try to defend the climate or to defend some place. So this is very important to support all these people in order for them to be able to play this role of a watchdog. But there are also very, very quiet mobilization at different scales, mobilizations that you can't see in the media, and that plays a role, the same role in local democracy, of playing this democratic part of saying no to different things in different municipalities or territories. So we should be conscious. And I think that the IPCC, at first, the first report, were not so much underlining it, but nowadays they say that civil society have to play a big role in being the one who watch for this climate in the future. So
I think it comes back to my point earlier about democracy. Because it's a democratic question, it's about taking back power. It has not always been like it is today. For our generations, this is all we know. We did not experience the time where the lobbyists did not exist. Because the lobbyists came with the economic crisis in the US. That's why it's linked to the lobby. They were organizing meetings in the lobbies of hotels with politicians, and this is how they build all what we know today. And it comes to the fact that we need to take back the power, the political power and this can happen only in democracies. Very often, when I say that the climate and the ecological crisis requires strong policy intervention, and very often the answer that I have is that this is going to happen in non-democratic regimes because it's easier in the non-democratic, but actually it's not true at all, because in non-democratic regimes you have the lobbyist system exists. It works differently from what we have in our countries, and that's why I think that it can happen only in democratic regimes, and it happens that we are lucky. It's the regimes, the highest emissions, when you count the historical emissions, come from democratic regimes. So we can win the battle because we are responsible. The emissions, the responsibility occurs in the countries where we have democracies.
Yes, on this point, 3 points. First of all, human beings behave for what they're rewarded for. So don't expect the CEO of a large company making 30 million or 40 million per annum this year to think about what will happen to the world in 50 years' time. You know, I'm making 30 million this year. On the system as it is, après moi le déluge for the French speakers. That's the first thing. Second thing, our colleague Daniel from Australia this morning gave a superb example of the link and illustrated in his country, but that's true, you know, working at EU level, it's exactly the same thing. I was swallowing your words, Daniel. I mean, it's like, you know, is he talking about the EU? No, he's talking about Australia. It's exactly the same thing. Short answer is cut the link, but cut it between private economic interest and policy-making politicians. You have to cut it. Until you've done that, and it's far from being done, and we heard this morning many ways through which it's being done, it will continue. It's the way it works, and that's indispensable. Third thing about lobbying. How does lobbying work? Start again. How does the lobbying get paid? I'm company XYZ. I'm hiring a lobbyist on a piece of regulation. That piece of regulation, if it's adopted by the legislators of whatever jurisdiction, will cost me X. You'll have a cut on what I will save if the legislation is not adopted. And if you fail in making it abort, not being adopted, please delay it as much as you can, which is why, you know, when the discussions don't go in the direction that lobbyists like, they will always negotiate and get 2, 3, 4 years delay in implementation, because 2, 3, 4 years is X amount of money, and they still get the money. People get, work for what they get paid for. So you have to be very, very realistic in addressing this. I agree with Yamina. It's a very important point made, but we're talking about democratic regimes here. So we have to go to the next step, and not only, I'm not saying this is what you said, but we should not assume that democracy as such is sufficient. We have to go one step further.
Sorry, I have to immediately comment on what you said. Human being is not like that. It's just that CEO are, yeah, of course you're wrong, and we are here to prove it. We prove it by our presence here. Of course we are thinking to the future. Of course we are thinking to next generation and the damage on the planet. Okay? So what's happened is that, sorry, you have my emotion, because what you said just reflects the worst of our society. CEO are just the bastards selected by the system, right? And in the culture, we know that our culture gives power to men, white men from some countries, and they have problem with their emotion. And that's why I take the freedom to show my emotion.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have question or response to? Yes, there is a question up there.
Yes, I will go. I will go up. I think we all understood that Thierry did not take this position for himself, but but.
I'm only a white man. I'm sorry, I didn't choose. Not against you. Apologies.
Okay. No, there is no question. Yeah. So, is there another question? I would have one question, because this debate is very frustrating for me, because I am giving the floor to anybody else. And I would like also to ask some questions about the solutions you propose, and about international cooperation. For the solution of an international tax, and the fact that a country could be the tax receiver in last resort, the last resort tax receiver, I think it could work. But how could we obtain that all firms in the world become responsible as you describe it? How could we obtain that brown financiers would be prevented to finance oil and or fossil fuel energies everywhere in the world? Don't you think that we will obtain something that is a partitioned world between two blocks? And I have some ideas about the countries where it would be impossible to regulate that. And for carbon emissions, it won't be the solution, because if we don't exploit, I apologize for that, but this is the discourse of the CEO of Total. But if we don't exploit oil reserves by ourselves, somebody else will do. And so if the European or American, even American oil companies don't exploit anymore, if the European and American banks don't finance anymore fossil fuel energies, perhaps Chinese and Russian companies will do. And where is the solution?
I don't have the solution, as I already said, right? But, I mean, if you look at, so what is necessary to change the purpose and the behavior of a firm, a single firm, right? What would be necessary? So unless you have an enlightened CEO, which may happen, actually, and there are some who really think about long term, but still, So you need to change the governance of the firm. That's where it is instrumental, right? You need to change that. You need to incorporate, to include the stakeholders in the governance and to give them really a very specific role about what to check, what to monitor. And you need to have maybe civil society watchdogs and so on the side as well. And you need to have monitoring by public agencies. So you need a combination of all these things to make sure that the firm behaves well. Right. And so if you want to expand that to all firms in one country, you need to have a regulation with all these structures, right? So all firms should have these norms of governance, should have these norms of reporting, should have this monitoring process and so on. And then we have the question of international competition, right? And we are back to this issue of how to do that. So you may be right. Maybe we are heading toward a two-block world where there will be different degrees of ambition. And it may be that one block will be able to have something that's working pretty well in terms of responsible behavior. But indeed, that's not sufficient to take care of the global common goods or the global public goods, right? For that, we need really a global collective action. And there remains the problem.
Yes, I think we are getting to the end of this round table, right? It's 4:15, yes. So thank you very much. I think we've heard that we need more regulation, that we need to change things. And actually the topic of this whole workshop was that it was very difficult to get them through, because it is going against the interest of the CEOs if they behave as if they wanted to continue earning money. And so I think it is very important what Nathalie said, that in order, and it's not incompatible, all these things are actually complementary. So we should work for regulation, for taxation, for governance, corporate governance change, stakeholder approach. But in order to obtain that, we do need some form of, as Daniel says, some form of regained democracy. And that should be, I think, about everywhere, in the firm, at the local level, on the streets. What we try to say, and we had a lot of evidence from different sectors, is that there are very strong interests that will not allow. They are not interested in what we are trying to do. They are not interested in saving the climate, and they are playing a free riding game. So let them save. I will continue to earn. So that is the conclusion maybe of this. I think we have to work, we have to think much more to devise very intelligent, and this bankruptcy idea, this other idea of new taxation scheme, this governance, stakeholder governance, how to concretely detail, materialize it. All this work is important, including to understand that the democratic part is necessary, because the best idea will never go through. So with that I would like to thank you all, and we shall continue working together to try to overcome or to meet that climate crisis that we have. Thank you very much. Thank you.